Hello, my name is Fred Pearce. I'm a British science and environment journalist, and I'm interviewing today Peter Kanowski, Professor of Forestry at the Australian National University, on the subject of genetic engineering and specifically genetically modified trees in forestry. Peter has for many years been involved in analysing the nature of dialogues that different groups of people have about GM trees, notably for the Forests Dialogue hosted by Yale University in the US, where he wrote a paper on opportunities for dialogue 9 years ago that I think remains worth reading. Here we want particularly to explore the lessons for forestry from the very different dialogues, or often failures of dialogue, I guess, that developed over GM agricultural crops. But first, Peter, I'd like to hear from you some introductory remarks on GM technologies in general and the controversies surrounding them. Where do you think the roots of these controversies lie? Do you think they're in the technologies themselves or in the political, economic and regulatory environment, perhaps? Are the technologies a lightning rod for other concerns about land grabbing or the industrialization of forests, for instance?
Yeah, thanks, Fred. Hello, and everyone. I think the answer to your question is a bit like the tree itself. There are multiple roots. All of those elements that you mentioned, I think, are part of the context that we have to address. Some of the foundations of the debate about genetically modified trees, as for other genetically modified organisms, lie in the different worldviews that people have about the people and the nature and their interactions. Some are from concerns about social justice and the roles of technologies in fostering injustice or greater equality. Some are from concerns about the environment itself, and some are for concerns for the risks to smallholder farmers and tree growers. So all of those elements are part of the context, but some, I think, are genuine fears of uncertainty about the consequences of genetic modification of organisms, in this case, trees. So there's a set of political contexts, both nationally and internationally, that are both mirrors of and shapers of these issues that contribute to, I think, a very complex set of issues, which it has been very difficult to wrestle with.
Is the technology the victim or the problem?
Yes, it's an interesting question. I think there's certainly a lightning rod in some circumstances. For example, the deployment of genetic technologies in agriculture happened as part of a whole approach to the agricultural value chain that was adopted by the leading business proponents of genetic technologies. And that so-called ag-biotech model, I think, has had a whole range of consequences around the use of genetic technologies in plant production systems. But of course, we've also got the application of those technologies in relation to the human genome and concerns that go with that. In the agricultural arena, those technologies are employed primarily, though not only, in the production of food crops. And so we've got the impacts on human health, or the potential impacts on human health, as a possibility. But I guess more generally, if we look through the period of history since the Industrial Revolution, most new technologies have been met with some skepticism and concern, because they change established patterns of livelihood. They change power relations and distribution of wealth in society. So I think they're all legitimate concerns that underpin the particular application of genetic technologies in this particular case.
Is it so? I mean, is this just a kind of teething problem that we see with any new technology, or I mean, are there real issues to be addressed?
I think there are real issues to be addressed, and some of those we might think of as the sort of issue that any new technology has to address. Some we might recognise as those that are really quite fundamental to the way that humans relate to nature, how we exercise the sort of extraordinary scientific knowledge that's been acquired, particularly over the last century in genetics, and how we apply that for the better. Mm-hmm. So I think the issues are indeed real, but some of them are perhaps manifest themselves more strongly because the technologies are new, the outcomes of the application are uncertain and contested, and the evidence base to inform us about making wise decisions is inadequate or still being formed.
In your 2012 paper, you identified 3 dialogues, which I'll try and summarize. One was sort of value-based debate in civil society, where many people want to take a very precautionary approach to what is often seen as a scary and novel still technology. And then the second was the dialogue among those, the more technocratically focused, looking specifically at the technology. Are there specific issues that we need to be addressed, control or whatever? And then a third dialogue centered on creating effective governance. Have I sort of correctly described those 3 dialogues? And I mean, how do they interact? And is the governance dialogue the sort of the final one that we need?
You have characterised correctly how I saw things nearly a decade ago. I think broadly speaking, those characterisations are still applicable. And so we've had another decade of learning about how those governance systems do or don't effectively regulate the application of genetic technologies. They do interact, of course. They interact imperfectly, and much of the literature over the last decade, now that I've gone back to look at what's been happening since I wrote the paper, much of the literature is focused on what we might learn from attempts at governing genetically modified organisms, again, not just in the arena of forests, but more widely.
So, I mean, are you encouraged by the progress that has been in the last 10 years on GMs in general? You know, if you from 2012, would you by now have expected a lot more?
Well, I think yes and no. If we speak just about the technology itself and the possibilities of the technology, I think the progress continues to be breathtaking. We've seen enormous advances in the application of genetic technologies in health and medicine. We've seen substantial advances in plant biotechnologies, including those that are applicable to trees. We've seen those technologies applied in a number of arenas. We haven't seen them applied so much in forests and trees, and that's largely because of the regulatory framework that has for the past 2 decades or so constrained their application on the one hand. It's also because relative to health and medicine or to agriculture, the forests arena is relatively small and relatively modest in its economic contribution, although it's, of course, absolutely fundamental for life on Earth. So I guess whilst the technologies have changed and their application in other arenas has progressed, there hasn't been a lot of change in their application in practice in the forestry sector. And I don't know that there's been that much change in the dialogue in the forestry sector. There's probably been more change in dialogue in some of the other arenas.
Let's turn now to talk a little bit more about the agricultural experience of GMs. You quoted somebody in your 2012 report as saying that the agricultural experience with GMs was, quote, a cautionary tale of how not to assess in emerging technology and allay public concern. Kind of everything that could have gone wrong did. What went wrong? Can you analyze exactly why we got it so wrong?
Yeah, so I think that was a quote from Kearns and some co-authors looking at the situation in Britain. And around the same time, Dennis Murphy, who's a plant breeder, wrote a book about biotechnology and agriculture. He characterised the ag biotech model, which emerged in the 1980s and was a business model based on the transgenic use of traits that were genetically straightforward and so amenable to manipulation at that relatively early stage of the whole genetic modification technologies. And those traits, such as herbicide or insect resistance, were coupled with agrochemical inputs by companies that owned the package, if you like, and were sold to farmers in a single package in exclusive sale contracts and contracts and technologies that precluded those farmers from saving and reusing, replanting the seed. So it was a business model that was based on the whole package and that locked a farmer in, as critics would say, to use of herbicides, use of particular chemical systems, and was essentially an industrial commercial production system. Now that might have worked well for farmers in the rich world, much more problematic when applied to farmers in the poor world. India is one of the largest users of GM cotton now, for example. So that model was essentially developed and promoted by the large companies that dominated the commercial agricultural sector. And it was developed, there was opposition from farmers groups and from those concerned with genetic modification, but essentially there wasn't what we might think of as any extended period of community debate. The model was essentially take it or leave it, and the nature of those agricultural large multinational supply chains and the conjunction of interests, I guess, meant that many saw that model sort of steamroller over opposition without the sort of more considered discussion about the wider implications. If we go back to those three levels of dialogue that I talked about, there wasn't really a civil society dialogue. There was a dialogue within the sort of interests of the agribusiness industry, perhaps, and those who are associated with regulating them. And I think many plant breeders would argue that there wasn't a lot of discussion amongst the science community either about the merits of different approaches as opposed to the value of the technology and its potential application. So, that's why Kearns and his co-authors characterised the way that the issue was approached in agriculture as being one that we should avoid in other sectors. And of course, because those initial crops were food crops primarily, the perception that consumers had that they were left with little choice than genetically modified food was then raised a lot of consumer concern about the nature of the product that was being generated and that they were expected to buy. So that model, I guess, continues to apply more or less in agriculture, but it hasn't applied in the forest sector. And I think that's been for a whole range of reasons. some of which are to do with the much stronger governance of forests than of agriculture. In another part of my academic work, colleagues from Yale and Oxford and I looked at it about the same time as I wrote the paper for the Forest Dialogue, looked at global regulation of forests. And one of our conclusions was that whilst it's far from perfect, globally, regulation of forests is pretty strong compared to that of other land uses. So that platform, in the case of forests, but also a history of multi-stakeholder engagement in forests, because forests are typically both public and private goods. We're all beneficiaries of the world's forests, whether we happen to own them or not. A significant proportion of the world's forests are publicly owned, and those that are privately owned deliver substantial benefits to the people who don't own them. So there's a long history of multi-stakeholder engagement in forests, and of course the Forest Stewardship Council itself is an outcome of that, from the failure of the Rio Earth Summit to agree stronger international arrangements about forests. So I think those factors in the case of forests have been quite significant in mediating, like, the transfer or the possible transfer of the agriculture model across to forests.
So I was going to ask you whether forestry has kind of learned the lessons of agriculture, but maybe they never quite arose in the issues never arose in the same form because of the different nature of forests and the different natures of forest governance.
Yeah, I think you know, again, without pretending they're perfect, I think that for the range of reasons that I mentioned, the forest sector had a different set of governance arrangements in place, some formal, some informal, some like the Forest Stewardship Council and its counterpart program for the endorsement of forest certification, private governance systems that are quite important. And you know, the FSC's position on genetic modification from the late 1990s has been a significant factor. The options around GM trees have been constrained.
Do you think that, highly speculative, but do you think without the FSC, many more forest companies would have adopted GMs rather than sort of fearing a backlash?
Governance systems work as a sort of package. And so I think for sure that the existence of the FSC and its ban on the use of GM trees has been a very significant determinant of the non-implementation of GM trees, but it's not the only one. There are commercial factors, the reality that the economic scale of the forestry sector is small compared to that of agriculture as a whole, that because the life cycle of trees is much longer, the investment periods for what are quite substantial costs are recovered over a longer period, and so there are constraints there. And with all due respect to many very bright colleagues working in forest genetics, there aren't as many of them as there are working on genetic applications in agriculture and health and medicine. So it's not just the regulatory constraint, I think, is the point that I want to make. But the regulatory constraint's been significant.
Does the nature of trees and forests make a difference too? I'm wondering perhaps about you know, the simple longevity of trees. They're not annual crops after all, and perhaps our ideas about the naturalness of forests. Do they change the nature of the practicalities of the technology, but also our perceptions?
Yes, they do. I think that those of us who argue in favour of forests and their conservation and sustainable management would point out the not just the environmental values of forests, but their social and cultural values. And of course, that's manifested variously in most societies globally, that forests are home to hundreds of millions of people, and they're the frontiers for agricultural expansion for many other hundreds of millions of people, that their values are contested, and that we've been, as a global community, really struggling to find ways to contain the forces of deforestation and forest degradation that are themselves contributing to very troubling loss of environmental services and to the global heating that we've been reminded of today as I speak to you in terms of the IPCC's latest report. So, forests as a whole have a wider set of values, perhaps than some agricultural crop systems, particularly those that are not culturally significant. But trees themselves, as long-lived organisms, also have significant cultural and social value. And so I think that those phenomena that have been quite explored in a range of literatures over the last couple of decades, I think are also significant for the case of forests. But we shouldn't also trivialise the biological differences between trees and agricultural crops and tree and crop breeding systems. Most commercially valuable food crops, annual crops, are inbreeding, and their breeding systems are much more amenable to genetic manipulation than outcrossing long-lived trees with long reproductive cycles. Tree breeders and geneticists deserve lots of credit for working with organisms that are somewhat more difficult to work with genetically than simple annual agricultural crops. I'm teasing the crop breeders here, of course.
Are you surprised by the spread of GM trees over the past decade? I mean, back in 2012, would you have expected more?
No, not really. I think that there's a range of factors that were always, I think, going to mean that the progress of the application of genetic modification to trees was slower than it was for agriculture. So just from a technical point of view, I think that's one factor. The range of concerns about application of genetic technologies in trees is often associated, though not only, with the industrial scale monoculture plantations that are most common and most productive in the global south, and the association in the eyes of many critics of that form of forest production system with land grabbing and the dispossession of Indigenous people and local people. And so the association between that form of land use and the application of genetic technologies has been a big constraint, I think, in those areas where, from a production system point of view, one might expect plantations to have expanded most. But I think we should also recognise that most trees that are used in plantation production systems are still relatively little domesticated compared to the crop plants that we use, or even to animals that are the mainstay of animal production systems. And so there's lots of gain that breeders can make from conventional breeding still. And so then there's an economic decision about where you invest your scarce resources. And tree breeders have got, more genetic variation up their sleeves still than many of the agricultural crop breeders. So for all those reasons, no, I'm not surprised that there hasn't been much expansion. There have been some trials. The scale of trials is reported to have increased, but it's still, at a very modest level, I think would be the best way of describing it.
Do you see those trends continuing, or do you how do you see things developing over, I don't know, 30 or even 50 years?
Maybe it's best to answer that question in terms of a couple of scenarios. I mean, one scenario is that the concerns that have constrained the use and application of genetic technologies in trees continue more or less as they have. And so tree production systems continue to be based essentially on conventionally bred plantation trees or trees that are harvested from natural or quasi-natural forests. That's one scenario. A second is that the scale and rate of environmental change associated with climate change are so great that the genetic resources that we have in the tree production systems that have been developed so far are just not up to responding to the changes that are occurring, and that we need to look to new technologies to help us develop breeds of tree that are adapted to novel conditions. I think another scenario which I worry the climate scenario is a very real one, and I worry about our capacity to adapt to that in our production systems. A related point is that, which we're seeing in parts of Europe, I know at the moment, we've seen in parts of North America, as the climate changes, as temperatures are warmer, winter temperatures are warmer, as well as summer temperatures and drought, we get a lot of tree mortality, we get pest infestations on a landscape scale, we get changes in forest ecosystems, we have more frequent and more severe fires, and so we've got disturbances in natural systems that create environmental conditions to which the natural forests are not well adapted. So that's part of that scenario as well. I guess there's a middle ground between those two of no change and lots of change, and that might be an optimistic scenario in terms of human well-being and climate change. But if we look at the expectations of where our wood and fibre are going to come from in the future, if we think about the benefits of a bioeconomy, a greater bioeconomy in that era where we need zero net emissions, more and more of our wood, about half our wood now comes from planted forests. And I think under most plausible scenarios, an increasing proportion of wood is going to come from planted forests. That's going to focus our attention on growing the most suitable trees with the least environmental and social impact in tree planted forest production systems. They don't have to be plantations in the way that we've known them. I've spent 25 years arguing that we need more complex plantation forests that are of different forms and better suited to smallholder growers as well as on a large scale. But I think under that sort of scenario, it's possible to imagine a future in which some forms of genetically modified trees might have a role, but only, a subset of roles within the broader array of a diverse suite of different sorts of planted forests.
Let's turn back to governance issues in GMs, and perhaps to the three competing dialogues that we mentioned earlier. Is the governance dialogue the one that can resolve the tensions? The final piece in the jigsaw that we need to get right in order, perhaps not for everybody to agree about everything, but to find ways to disagree without turning the table over?
Yes, well, I mean, your jigsaw analogy is probably quite a good one, because I think the governance component can't be separated from the other two components in that sort of simplistic classification that I used. And that's, of course, because, what we're governing is determined by the science in a way. or determined and informed. We spoke before about how gene editing was different in a number of important respects from genetic transformation with genes from other organisms. So that's an example of where a governance system might need to respond to that change in technology. And as an example, the US and the EU as the two sort of dominant elements in the various aspects of the global economy around biotechnology have taken different views there. The US is comfortable, as it is generally, with genetic modification. Europe continues to treat gene editing as equivalent to other forms of genetic modification. As another example, Australia's taken a sort of middle ground there, and our gene technology regulator doesn't specifically regulate gene editing where it's not introducing, where it's essentially allowing natural processes to take their course. There's a threshold that they've used for that. So that's an example of how the governance system around genetic technology might adapt to changes in technologies.
Can it deliver areas of agreement where there has been disagreement? Is it, or is that being too hopeful?
Well, that brings me to the next part of my response to your first question. To have a governance system that can resolve those technical issues requires a civil society engaged dialogue that has had to build the foundations of understanding, acknowledgement of other perspectives than one's own, and a sense of the risks associated with different options. There's been a recent review of experiences from agricultural and forest biotechnology by Riccardo Paglia and colleagues at the University of British Columbia, which I was very interested to read more or less a decade on from the work that I'd done. And they concluded very much, I think very rightly, if I can put it that way, very appropriately, that that addressing the governance system in this broader context and recognising that it was embedded in a particular political and social context was fundamental to getting the good governance outcomes. And they talked in their review, drawing from some work others have done, on so-called upstream dialogue, that is building dialogue in civil society and with the science community, with the regulator, well ahead of the time that specific decisions need to be made. And so I guess if we look, a decade ago, more or less, when the Forest Dialogue convened the dialogue series that this original paper was written for, that was part of that process of what we now call as upstream dialogue. And I think that's a good example. We could look to some of the Nordic countries. There's been some recent work that I'm aware of, and there's doubtless other work that I'm not aware of, but work in Norway where they've been looking at the ethical foundations that would need to be embedded in better regulatory systems for genetic organisms. The Danes have been doing the same. There's been some very interesting work for more than a decade at universities in Denmark around these issues that have looked specifically at the sort of broader sets of social circumstances and framings of genetic issues and thought about how to reflect those in dialogue and decision processes that are respectful of that diversity of opinion. And so I think that's sort of where we need to get to. So the governance system that as I'm seeing it, is not just the sort of regulatory outcome, if I can put it that way. It's the processes, the social processes, the dialogue processes that that regulatory system draws from and is embedded in.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, so some people couch regulatory functions in terms of safeguards, sort of tick box of social and environmental conditions, but you're talking about something a much more sort of kind of holistic dialogue.
Well, I think we can see that if we don't have that, we end up with the ag biotech outcome from a social point of view, and I don't think that's where we want to be. I think that we have an opportunity in forestry, I think, because we have had the regulatory brakes on, and the other sorts of brakes as well that I've talked about on the development of genetically modified trees over the last 2 decades, and that's been frustrating for those proponents of genetically modified trees, who I think deserve respect for their scientific knowledge and their insights into what genetically modified trees could deliver, just as those who are concerned about the risks associated with that, not just the environmental risks, but some of the other social risks that we've been talking about.
Can we turn for the final section of this discussion to the FSC? We mentioned earlier your sense that the FSC had been quite influential in the development of the debate about GM trees. As you'll know, it's now considering how or whether it should try and intervene in a debate about governance, I suppose you'd say, of GM technology in forests, not by certifying forests containing GM trees, but by not throwing out of the organization and involvement with the organization companies that want to undertake trials in this area. What kind of sense do you get from that, just as a proposition?
Well, I think it's a proposition. I'll take a step back and then answer your question. In favour of the FSC and the role that it's played in forest governance globally is its very deliberate structure of recognising and representing different arenas of interest and in giving voice to interests that may not have had voice without that very explicit structure. And so, I think in terms of a place to have a debate about difficult forest governance issues, the FSC's a pretty good place to have that. So that's one consideration, I think. The forest dialogue only addresses issues that are very difficult, calls them fracture lines, and that's why the forest dialogue addressed genetically modified trees a decade ago. And the issues retains those characteristics of being very difficult. In the policy literature, these sorts of issues are often described as wicked problems, where they're hard to get an outcome that has a broad consensus. I think we are in a different situation for the reasons we've been talking about. But my view is that there are a number of circumstances that have changed over the last 20 years. The alarming realisation of what climate change is likely to do and the consequences that we've talked about there is one that's relevant to all sorts of forest governance issues. Advances in genetic technology that arguably, and I think this is a matter for scientific discussion, but arguably mean that they're less intrusive and, in the case of gene editing, more accelerated natural processes. That's a plausible line of argument that is worth exploration and might suggest that a technology that might be easier to accept. One could make a plausible argument that there's been enough change in the circumstances that the original 1999 ban, in the terms that it was implemented, was framed in to be worth revisiting the issue, whatever the outcome of that revisiting is.
So is your sense that FSC could have a useful role in promoting effective governance of GM trees, or would it be kind of a sideshow of limited relevance?
No, I think whatever FSC decides to do will be consequential. Mm-hmm. I think that, as we talked about previously, I think the FSC has been consequential for forest governance globally for the last 25 years. It hasn't been as consequential as many of us would like in terms of the impacts on deforestation and on degradation and on the balance of certified forests between the global north and the global south. But the FSC organisation, I think, have been significant positive influences on forest governance, and I'd like to see them continue to be significant positive influences on forest governance. And it was the right thing to do then. It was the right thing for the FSC to engage with the big issue of the import of tropical timber into Britain. And to its credit, the British forestry sector found a way to eventually essentially embrace and work with the FSC. And, without stretching the analogy too much, I think that, here we have another very difficult issue, but an issue that does deserve consideration, and there isn't really an alternative deliberately structured forum that's, I think, capable of the deliberative process that the FSC could bring to bear on this issue if it chose to, and I think it would be a good thing if it chose to.
So if FSC became involved or sanctioned, didn't decry a specific trial project into some aspects of GM trees, I mean, what should it be looking to get from, and perhaps what should the governance regime be, and what safeguards should perhaps be put in place as, I don't know, preconditions maybe for FSC sanction? Can you envisage something useful being done there? What could be done usefully and beneficially?
Sure. And to be clear, I'm not trying to advocate the decision that FSC should come to, just that it should have the discussion about that decision. Were it to come to a decision to allow some sort of trialling of GM trees, I think that there are some well-established governance principles and regulatory frameworks that it would want to make sure were implemented. We spoke before about some of the work that's going on in countries like Norway and Denmark on ethics-based foundations for regulatory framework. So I think that'd be one place to start, because that speaks to the inclusive and respectful foundations of a governance system. In more technical terms, I think that we've probably got enough experience over the last 20 years or so of gene regulation to have a reasonably clear sense of where the best practice is and how that best practice might be adopted for trees. And so I imagine that you'd want a set of ethically founded principles that were translated into a system that was based around a very precautionary risk assessment, but that risk assessment was very well informed by science, and that the scope in a number of dimensions of any trial was well parameterized, so that it was clear what the boundaries and timeframes were, so that it didn't become a Trojan horse for genetic engineering, as indeed the American chestnut's been argued to be a Trojan horse for the introduction of genetic technologies in trees. And I don't think that's necessarily really the case either, because I think you could regulate that effectively in its own right. And I imagine that that could be done with whatever scope FSC wanted to give those trials.
Peter, very many thanks. That was fascinating, and I hope the viewers will have gained a lot from it too. So very many thanks, Peter. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Fred, and it's an important issue for us all, and I'm glad to be able to contribute from the knowledge base I have, and encourage FSC to draw on the many other knowledge bases around as well.